You ever wonder why it's legal for you to drink 5 cups of coffee and get heart palpitations, but the second you want to try a little bit of opium, you're a bad guy? Look no further. This is another book report from Guys Can Read, and today I'm diving into This Is Your Mind on Plants by Michael Pollan. Pollan can get a little highfalutin at times, but this is the second of his books that I've read because every one of his books puts my head in a pretzel and begs really, really good questions about the interactions between humans and the natural world. And This Is Your Mind on Plants, Pollan takes us through an in-depth look at a sedative, a stimulant, and a hallucinogenic that are found naturally occurring in plants, namely opium, caffeine, and mescaline. And then in each section, Pollan provides cultural and historical context on each of these chemical compounds. For example, in mescaline, he takes us through the uses of peyote and the San Pedro or Wachuma cactus by native tribes in the United States. He then also performs what's described by the back cover of the book as participatory journalism. For opium, he ends up making a tea with dried poppies. And for caffeine, he does a 3 month long break from caffeine, which is crazy. And then for mescaline, he actually ends up participating in a Wachuma ceremony and ingesting mescaline capsules in the privacy of his own home. This is why it's called participatory journalism. He's actually participating with the subject matter that he's talking about. This context, combined with personal experiences that Pollan uses in this book, also injected with a hefty dose of personal musings about the subjects, make This Is Your Mind on Plants a pretty quick read, but heavily informative. Now, why did I read This Is Your Mind on Plants? The first reason that I read it was because Michael Pollan's name was attached to it. I mentioned it earlier, but Omnivore's Dilemma is also a really good book to check out if you're interested in modern agricultural supply chain. I liked the book enough that I wanted to read more of his stuff, and that's how This Is Your Mind on Plants came on my radar originally. Now, I also don't participate in the use of opium or mescaline, but God knows I use caffeine. I've always been interested in fiddling my intake of caffeine, consumption of caffeine, so I was interested in what he had to say on the subject for that reason. And then the third reason I wanted to read This Is Your Mind on Plants is because it studies substance use to attain what Pollan refers to as altered states of consciousness. As a regular user of both caffeine via drinks as well as nicotine via tobaccoless pouches, I have always been interested in what is considered normal, what is considered like okay, philosophically, ethnically, yada yada yada. So the use of stimulants to achieve these states of altered consciousness is something that I was really interested in reading as I picked up this book. Okay, and This Is Your Mind on Plants. Pollan does a really good job of speaking to like what's going on in the current political discourse around opium, caffeine, and mescaline. Starting with opium, he takes us through in the opium chapter a funny story about how basically it's a very gray area. Like if you grow poppies, the flower that produces opium, with no knowledge of the psychoactive compound, basically, if you can feign ignorance, then you are technically, legally speaking, safe. But if you do this knowingly, then you become a criminal. Like if you start clipping or drying opium poppies, if you are lacerating or scoring your seed pods to get at this sap inside of the plant with intention, then you are in violation of the law. I thought that was kind of weird. I don't know, laws are weird, right? In the mid 1990s, actually, there were a few DEA agents who were trying to get like trade magazines, like gardening magazines and stuff, to stop listing the poppy flowers that could be used to produce opium because they were doing like a quiet crackdown, that's Pollan's term for it, to get opium out of the market. At the end of this section, Pollan actually does point out that the real fight here was never about like opium poppies or the poppy flower. And instead, he redirects to the story of Purdue Pharmaceutical and Oxycontin, because now I think that's probably more what society associates with opioids or opioids, um, versus like poppy flowers. So maybe poppies were never the concern. So moving on to caffeine, the Food and Drug Administration has cited 400 milligrams of caffeine as being a safe amount for adults. And I put that in air quotes, but generally speaking, that's about 4 cups of coffee or 2.5 cans of like Monster Energy drink. And that's what the FDA is considering like okay for you to drink. Maybe if you go beyond that, you're veering into dangerous territory. Caffeine is actually so important to the American workforce that the courts made it mandatory to compensate workers for coffee breaks in the 1950s. There was a case where the U.S. Department of Labor sued a company in Denver called Los Wigwam Weavers to actually mandate that their employees were compensated for coffee breaks. It wasn't really, there wasn't a legal precedent before that. And the success of the suit, I'll read this off my screen. The success of the suit actually rested on this idea that though the breaks certainly benefited the workers, they were at least equally beneficial to the employer as they promoted more efficiency and resulted in a greater output. And this increased production is one of the primary factors, if not the prime factor, which leads the employer to institute such breaks in the first place. Coffee now and its supply in the US is more determined by economic forces, though, than political forces. And it's not like political context per se, but it is interesting that of like $10 you might spend for a cup of coffee, Pollan says only $1 of that usually makes it back to the farmers who grew the coffee, which is super unfortunate that there's that much supply chain in between us and the growers. And I'm postulating personally that like maybe we'll see some more regulations on that get pushed in the coming years. Because coffee is, it's America's drink. I think it's possible we might see more regulation and price controls put in place on that. And then finally, mescaline. Two of the biggest organizations working in peyote law today are the IPCI, which is the Indigenous Peyote Conservation Initiative, as well as the Native American Church, which was incorporated, I believe, in the 1920s or 30s. Recently, the IPCI purchased about 600 acres of land outside of Laredo, Texas, where the peyote cactus grows, to ensure access for American Indians to be able to pilgrimage to these peyote grounds and harvest peyote buttons. The alternative to that is what's called a peyotero. It's a farmer who's licensed by the state of Texas or other southern states to farm peyote and then sell it. What they do is actually rip the plant out of the ground and harvest it, versus what groups like the IPCI are advocating for, which is actually just to slice off the button that produces the psychoactive compound mescaline. So the IPCI making this move on behalf of the Native American Church is really important. The IPCI is also trying to get around Texas legislation currently, which says that peyote can't be cultivated. And what the IPCI is trying to do is basically get a license from the DEA that allows it to cultivate peyote inside of greenhouses. As far as peyote laws go, in 1994, Clinton signed the American Indian Religious Freedom Act amendments, which made it legal for members of the Native American Church to use, transport, and possess peyote. Fast forward to today, we're at this interesting moment where groups like Decriminalize Nature, which Pollan mentions in this book, are trying to decriminalize, I believe the word is entheogens, or plant medicines in various states across the country, ultimately pushing for mass decriminalization of psilocybin, peyote, ayahuasca, you name it. This is actually putting Decriminalized Nature at odds with groups like the Native American Church. And this could end up in an increase in demand, which the Native American Church is saying could end up putting peyote on the endangered species list and compromise the ability of native tribes to get access to this compound and peyote cactus. This is an actively evolving conversation. We had the initiative get passed in Portland a few years ago, which decriminalized all drugs. So as more of these victories get ratcheted up for decriminalized nature, I'll be listening for Native American and Indigenous commentary on these matters because, as Pollan points out in this book, they may not necessarily be happy about these victories. Okay, now running through a few of my favorite bits from This Is Your Mind on Plants. These are quotes, and I'll give like a little bit of commentary after each one. So first off, I suspect I'm benefiting from the echoes of Puritanism still reverberating in our culture, which even now awards points for self-discipline and overcoming desire. Addiction, even to a relatively harmless and easily procured drug like caffeine, is seen as evidence of weakness of character. This is so interesting to me because it begs this really cool question like, if you hear about somebody foregoing caffeine or foregoing nicotine or foregoing alcohol, your automatic reaction is like, oh, that's cool. I wish I could do that. That's awesome. Like, why do we believe that? Is it really a carryover of our Puritan, like New England colonies back when the country was founded? I don't know. That's really interesting. I'd love to explore that further. If you know any groups that are, or books that talk about like drug stigma, please let me know in the comments. Second quote. By comparison, caffeine's big contribution to human progress has been to intensify spotlight consciousness, the focused, linear, abstract, and efficient cognitive processing more closely associated with mental work than with play. This, more than anything else, is what made caffeine the perfect drug not only for the age of reason and the Enlightenment, but for the rise of capitalism, too. What a concept. Is it possible? I'm not saying this is the case or not. Is it possible that the only reason caffeine has managed to attain this like elevated status among psychoactive compounds is because caffeine directly supports like the goals of capitalism and our economy? Like, I don't know. I'll leave it for you to decide. Third up, this is a quote that Pollan uses from National Geographic. The principal reason that caffeine is used around the world is to promote wakefulness, but the principal reason that people need that crutch is inadequate sleep. Think about that. We use caffeine to make up for a sleep deficit that's largely the result of using caffeine. Kind of a mindfuck, if we're being honest. Also really makes me want to not use caffeine, like, all the time. The war on drugs is in truth a war on some drugs, their enemy status the result of historical accident, cultural prejudice, and institutional imperative. This was from the section on opium, and it really puts a bow nicely on a lot of what Pollan's talking about in this book. Basically saying that, like, it could be a fluke, or it could be like the result of some higher initiative that some plants are considered to be like, holy, or some plants are considered to be like dangerous and damning if you use them. I just thought that quote like nicely encapsulated a lot of what Pollan's talking about in this book. All right, so finally, let's get around to Should You Read This Is Your Mind on Plants by Michael Pollan. Of the few books that I've talked about on this channel so far, I would say this is probably the most narrowly appealing to people, if we're being quite honest. This, like most of Pollan's books, is a good recommendation for anybody with an interest in the natural world. Examples would be like gardeners, biologists, or Boy Scouts. If you're interested in pharmacology and the use of drugs, this also could be a really good read for you. He gets into like psychoactive compounds, and it's pretty easy to draw like parallels between the compounds he mentioned in this and like other drugs that you might use or come in contact with, I guess, on a regular basis. If science, generally speaking, is something that puts you to sleep quickly, I would recommend ignoring this book. He does a good enough job with the narrative that you might be able to skate by, but there is a lot of discussion in this book about like taxonomy, about like Papaver somniferus, the poppy plant, and like different strains. And Pollan himself mentions that it makes his head spin. So if you're not like a science person, like maybe steer away from this. To summarize, like I loved this book. I thought it was really interesting. I don't know if I'd recommend it to anybody. Anyway, that wraps up this book report on This Is Your Mind on Plants by Michael Pollan. As always, please like this video, subscribe to the Guys Can Read YouTube channel, follow us on Instagram at Guys Can Read, and we'll see you next time.